So our final presenter today, I actually learned a little story while meeting Rory, and he was talking with Yoav. You guys don't mind if I share? No. It's the early days of Kenshu, actually, when Yoav could give a demo, and he was presenting to Rory, and he thought it was all about information finding, fact finding, nothing really. You know, the company was really going in a different direction. They went in and presented, and Rory did the thing that every salesperson in the world loves. I'll take it. They came back and worked out, and I think it was one of our first clients. So, what's that? Outside of Israel. Yeah. So, one of our first clients outside of Israel. And now he's here. He's the vice chairman of Ogilvy, and he's going to be talking to us about, are we creating a culture where it pays to be boring? My wife would say, have you created a relationship with me where you're boring? But that being said, let me bring up the vice chairman of Ogilvy, Rory Sutherland.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. Also, I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in than the B video, because I was going to start with it. And so you can all go 5 minutes earlier through not having to have me present the B video first. But if you think about it, how the way the Bs work, you have 80% of them who are effectively, you know, there have been 20 million years of bee evolution. And as you said, you would have expected bee accountants to have evolved, saying, we want a greater level of compliance with the waggle dance to bring our nectar collection targets in line with our forecast for Q3. And they indeed do that. And for 80% of the bees, it varies actually, the ratio between creative bees and what you might call efficiency bees varies depending on the sort of the surrounding flora, how close you are to the equator as well. But there's always a trade-off between narrow short-term optimization and something else. And a narrow focus for too long on a single metric is nearly always disastrous. And there are a variety of reasons why this is so. I mean, in many cases, people learn to game the system. The longer you stick with a particular metric of judgment, people on the other end start gaming the system. In the NHS, you may have noticed when you ring your GP, if you try and book an appointment next week, they'll tell you to ring back at 8 o'clock in the morning, won't they? Okay? The reason for that is there's a metric for GPs, which is how many patients they see on the day that an appointment was requested. So if they refuse to let you book appointments in advance, they hit 100% and earn a great big brownie point. Outside hospitals, people are kept in ambulances, immobile, for an hour before they're admitted to a hospital because there's a metric about how quickly patients are seen after they've been admitted. And if they're sitting in a hospital car park, technically they haven't been admitted, so again you can game the system. So that's one reason why metrics should always change. The other reason why metrics should always change, if you focus too heavily on one thing, you create short-term efficiency gains at the price of long-term fragilization. And so what those Bs are doing with the trade-off is they're essentially saying, yep, part of what we do, the ROI is very simple. Nectar collected in energy value has to exceed the cost of collecting it. But they take some of those gains from efficiency and kind of invest them in a sideline venture. And the ROI for that sideline venture is very different. Most of those journeys are a total waste of time, but 1 in 1,000 of them pays back 10,000-fold. You suddenly discover you go over the hill in an unfashionable direction, and suddenly a whole field of flowers has burst into bloom. And you go, shit, look at the nectar here. And you go back and tell people about it. And there always has to be a trade-off, I think, between a narrow focus on short-term optimization and something else. I'd also argue, by the way, there's an ethical problem we've got to watch with programmatic, which is that algorithms don't really have a moral sense. Now, I've worked in an advertising agency for 28 years. In meetings, it's okay occasionally to suggest unethical things. They're the kind of unethical creative ideas which you get promoted for suggesting them, but fired for enacting them. So I can confidently say, if you had a meeting, my own strapline yesterday, which was, you know, reduce knife crime, carry a gun, for example. That's not going anywhere, okay? The reason we do that is it's okay in an ad agency to have a culture of silly. In fact, the principal value of an ad agency is that it's a culture in which you can make stupid suggestions and still get promoted. And it's very important we maintain that culture. I'm actually wondering about having sort of free speech codes enacted for the simple reason that sometimes the route to something new and different lies, the bright sunlit uplands lie first by climbing Mount Slightly Stupid. Okay, so you have to accept stupid suggestions. And I'm sure if you sat on an ad agency and you had a booze brief, someone would say, why don't we advertise in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous? And everyone would go, very, very funny, but there's not a chance in hell we're doing that. An algorithm will learn to do exactly that. It will suddenly discover that converting ex-alcoholics to drinking is a hugely profitable activity. It will learn that converting ex-gambling addicts to your poker site is spectacularly lucrative, and without knowing what it's doing, that's what it'll do. And we have to be really, really scared about this, because human beings are hackable to a degree. And so an algorithm will simply find that a behavior is, a black box algorithm will simply find that a behavior works in financial terms, and it will look at nothing else. It won't ask the how, it will only ask the what. Algorithms may also turn out to be racist, for example. There are enormous areas, I think, for concern here. It's particularly true because of the mobile age. What happens if you want to give up an addiction? I'm not speaking from experience here, if you're a former heroin addict, one of the things you'll be told is that place where you used to buy your gear, you can't even go within 3 blocks of that place for the rest of your life. Because exposing yourself to the context exposes you to temptation. One of the reasons it's very difficult to give up those drugs is you've practically got to give up all your friends as well. But people can give up bad habits by controlling their context. If you used to be a gambling addict, don't read the sports pages, the racing pages of the newspaper. For instance, don't go into bookmakers, don't go into casinos. The mobile phone makes context inescapable. Wherever you go, whatever you're reading, the algorithm will serve you temptation. And I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with a world where people who want to give up an addictive or repetitive habit find it impossible to do. So moral rant over, but I do this just to make the point that although I'm by and large optimistic about advertising, I'm not totally blind to some of its possible failings. What I'm here to talk about is the optimistic side, which is, I think that there lies the possibility, dotted all over the place, for what you might call marketing moonshots. Those of you from Google will be familiar with it. Everybody knows the term. You have Alphabet X, led by Astro Teller. Their aim is to produce those rare one-off improvements where something is changed by an order of magnitude. It's not an incremental improvement, very much like the Rogue Bees, in fact. You know, a percentage of your budget invented in those things which are total game changers. You have a very high chance of failure. You have a low chance of success, but the upside from success is potentially absolutely massive. And they're investing in X. And it's called X, of course. It's called X partly because it sounds mysterious, but it's also the Roman X, 10 times. My contention is that doing this in engineering terms is increasingly hard. Doing this in psychological terms is comparatively easy. In many cases, making a train 10 times faster, making jet travel, air travel 10 times faster, you're running up against the laws of physics. Making a train journey 10 times more enjoyable, on the other hand, or 10 times more productive, or 10 times more useful, might be comparatively easy. Why am I so optimistic? I'm optimistic because, oddly, we don't know very much about psychology. And the opportunity for improvement is greatest in the areas where we know the least. We already know quite a lot about engineering, we know quite a lot about physics. So therefore, if the opportunity for 10x improvement exists, we possibly know where it lies already. And it's just a real bastard to do. In the case of psychology, we're so blind to our own psychology, something several earlier speakers have already alluded to. We're completely blind to the weird, distorted way in which we see the world. We're completely confined in many cases by very, very narrow frames of reference in looking at things. that the opportunity to discover something wow is much greater. So my challenge for marketers, and this applies to marketers, not just advertising agencies, I think there are tons and tons of problems we could solve that we've never been asked to solve. And we've partly made that mistake by calling ourselves marketers, by being associated exclusively with communications rather than psychological insight, and also as marketers using a wacko vocabulary which means it's impossible to be taken seriously in the C-suite. The language of marketing is a bit like, as one colleague of mine said, it's a bit like the language of astrology. If you're talking to fellow believers, it's fine. If you're talking to anybody else, you sound like a nut job. Okay? Going into the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, and saying, talking about brand iconography is like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St. Thomas's Hospital and saying, we must trust to the healing power of the crystal. Okay. Now, in a quest, I think, to be taken seriously, we have obsessed about those parts of marketing which are highly measurable and highly quantifiable. Just because they're measurable and quantifiable doesn't mean they're the most valuable things we could do. They mean they're the safest things to do from a career point of view, because no one ever gets fired for being too heavily quantified. But an enormous amount of activity within business is actually, when you're cynical about human motivation, and I'll explain this later, it's arse covering under the guise of rigor. Famous phrase David Ogilvy quoted, often attributed to him, bit unfair, it was another Scotsman, a philosopher. Many people use statistics the way a drunk uses a lamppost, for support rather than illumination. And there are many, many cases in advertising where people go off and research the efficacy of a campaign to the 17th decimal point, but what they find doesn't affect what they do. Regardless of whether the ROI is 5 or 1.2, it doesn't change the amount of money they subsequently spend on that activity. That's fairly good evidence, I think, that the reason for the research is to secure your own job, not actually to change your behaviour. So, very quickly, I think what a moonshot is where you change perception rather than reality. Now, a very interesting phrase worth knowing, one of the guys behind the Apollo program, I only learnt this quote very recently, he simply said that a change of frame, a change of your frame of reference in looking at a problem is worth 80 IQ points. Explains actually why quite a lot of successful entrepreneurs, quite a lot of successful people in marketing actually appear to be quite stupid. If they're good at changing the frame of reference, it doesn't matter how good they are at maths. It's a really, really valuable talent on its own. And nearly everything, every problem is defined by people like economists, by engineers, by physicists. It's defined in terms of what can be numerically expressed and measured. Because human perception is difficult to quantify, there are no SI units for regret, okay? You know, we have seconds, we have meters, we have, you know, bits, bytes, lots and lots of those things are measurable. There isn't a measurement for reputation, there isn't a measurement for trust, there isn't a measurement for anxiety. And so those things get overlooked because the people who want to define the problem are trying to define the problem within a mathematical model. At some point we have to go as marketers and go, we don't know a lot about this shit, but by God is this worth experimenting with. This, by the way, is nature's most valuable, not necessarily first or most successful, attempt to solve a problem through tinkering with perception, not reality. It's the chili, finest plant on the planet, in my opinion. In fact, it's interesting, isn't it, that the Renaissance effectively happened in Europe at around the same time that chilies and tobacco arrived. What it does is it solves an interesting problem. How the hell can I be really, really hot so that, I think it's, let me get this right, that parrots eat me, but insects and mammals don't. It wants to be propagated by parrots. Now, it's difficult to produce a successful plant that operates at 90 degrees centigrade. You know, no plants manage to do that. What it does, capsaicin in the chili, do you know this? Chili isn't hot at all. It's not really burning you, okay? It's not hurting your mouth or other parts of your digestive tract. All capsaicin does is it tinkers with your senses, with your body's perception, so that anything consumed in conjunction with capsaicin feels much hotter than it really is. So it makes your body behave as though you're hot without actually being hot at all. It's a total hack. Now my contention is, I think we can do this in marketing. Don't change the reality. Have we got a... This one seems to have died. Are we on to the next slide? Ah, there we go. This is the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. Now I'll just explain something. As marketers, your finance department basically hates you. And the reason a finance department hates you is because most people in finance use as a mental model of the world economics. Economics achieves an extraordinary level of apparent mathematical certitude by attributing to human beings a spectacularly unnuanced, mono-directional view of human motivation. It assumes that every single purchase, every single decision we make as human beings is made in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. And economics takes that as axiomatic before it starts demonstrating its mathematical models. What you've got to realize is that's why they hate you. Because in such a world, perfect information, perfect trust, marketing wouldn't need to exist. So in their mental model of the world, marketing is a necessary, at the best, at the worst it's evil because it's distorting human preference. At the best, it's a cost to be minimized, not a source of value creation. The Austrian economists, von Mises, Hayek, etc., knew this was total bollocks. The Austrians understood that all value is subjective and is much a product of the context in which something is perceived as what something really is. You can generate huge value by just changing a frame of reference. Who's got an espresso machine here? Okay, got one myself, love it like a child, okay? It is insanely expensive. I'm sorry to disabuse you of this. If you had to buy an espresso coffee in a jar like Nescafe or Maxwell House, for an equivalent amount of coffee, a jar of Nespresso coffee would cost about £45. And you look at that and go, shit, that's insane. There's no way I'm paying that. It would have gone nowhere if it had been sold in a jar. But it's not sold in a jar, it's sold in a pod. We don't know what an individual Nescafe costs, unless you're one of those sad people who puts individual portions into cling wrap and writes the price on each one. No. So when we use that 29p pod in our espresso machine, our frame of reference is not Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we think, well, it's cost me 29p, would have cost me £2.30 at Starbucks. This machine's practically paying for itself. Okay? Whether something is expensive or cheap entirely depends on our frame of reference. Rolls-Royce, Maserati learnt this. They stopped exhibiting their cars so heavily at car shows and started exhibiting them at boat and plane shows. At a car show, a €300,000 car looks really pricey. When you've been looking at Learjets all morning, it's an impulse buy, okay? Now, von Mises understood this, that actually, by the man who sweeps the floor, he explicitly means advertising and marketing. That the value of a restaurant is a product, and I mean product in a proper sense, of the food that you produce and the context in which it's consumed. If you have a great product and you market it badly, you fail. That's probably the saddest thing you can do. Create something that has immense potential value and market it in such a way that people can't see the value, or can't trust you, or aren't brave enough to risk the social opprobrium which might come with making a bad decision. Now, where are we going to find an example of a fantastic product terribly marketed? The answer is Australia. 2 comedians. And here goes.
Hello. Hi. Whee! Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name. Normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
How you feeling?
I already know what's going on.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got you Sheeran. Who wants some Sheeran?
Oh, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think I should anyone?
I don't think we'll get it. It's going to be a brave soul.
I wouldn't come into, if there was a dude with a beard and a hat saying like, come in and see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
You want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Insurance. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? You're lost. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here. Beautiful ginger haired man. Sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there, you want him? $2. $2 for a peep. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm alright. I'm alright.
Hey, big fella, got Ed Sheeran you need in there, $2.
What is it?
All the Ed Sheeran you need.
What?
Ed Sheeran.
Oh, I don't know.
Is it a singer? Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. How's it going? You guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second peep.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
Category.
Dirt sheet peep. Dirt sheet peep. Here we go, $2.
Do you reckon we're pricing it too high, and that's why we're not getting people coming in?
I think $2 is pretty fair.
There we go, boys. It's a Friday. Get you Ed Sheeran peep show. $2. Sitting on a stool, play your song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, I might quickly give you the go-ahead to take off all your clothes. Are you willing to do that?
Been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You're not?
A couple of months ago, maybe, but
Yeah.
I'm in shape. It's just the shape of a potato.
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well. But just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran? You like Ed Sheeran? $2 each show. Just got him sitting on stage in there. Oh, $2. It's gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds though. You okay? Hey? Well, there's only one way to find out.
We might be on here.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there till midday. All right, your choice.
No, she did the smart thing and walked away.
Listen, if you guys want, I'm just saying, if you guys want to have a go, he's sitting in there by himself, it'll probably get busy later on. $2, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want, just $2 a hand. Everything's above board, I can assure you. No, absolutely not. Like, I can't guarantee what it'll do, but yeah. Pay $2.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take it.
Did you guys go to peep shows a lot or what? There you go, man. Keep your clothes on, stay on the seat. Behave yourselves. Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your peep.
Hello, welcome to the Peep Show. Your time will start in 5 seconds.
Darling, I will be loving you till we're 17. Baby, my heart still flies hard 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Now, by the way, that's the funniest example of something that's a brilliant product but terribly marketed. That's what you might call a 10 times minus 10, okay? I genuinely believe there are plus 10s dotted all around the place. Now, I'll give you an example of this, by the way. We now know from behavioural science that people discount the future very heavily. To be honest, there's an evolutionary reason for this, but actually, we probably discount it more than we should. But to give you one example of this, to incentivize people to get a pension, the government gives you a complete tax rebate on every pound you put into a pension, starting at the age of, say, 20, 25. Now, what we know about psychology is that a benefit that's 20 or 30 years deferred has a very low perceived value because we discount something. What it effectively says is, get this pension now, and you'll get a lot of extra money when you're really old, okay? That costs the government £20 billion a year, and I would argue that the motivational effect of that incentive, however rational it appears to economists, is less than if you said, get a pension and we'll give you a free iPad. Okay? So if you don't believe there are 10x things where economics is diametrically wrong about what really motivates humans to think, decide, and act, there are small ones, there are really, really big ones. There are great products which are just unfortunately named. Anybody here got a Philips air fryer? Nobody. Ah, do you think it's fantastic? Yeah, one of the best things you've ever bought, right? Okay, I totally agree. There's always one person in the audience, they always agree it's the best thing they've ever bought. It fries food not with fat, but with superheated air. So you can produce crisp chips, you can produce, you know, heat up pies, so they're really crunchy and flaky as God intended, but there's no fat involved. In Asia, they sell like crazy. Why? Because frying is cooking in Asia. You don't really have an oven in Asia. They realize that, as God intended, the way to cook food is to fry it, okay? In Europe, they call it the air fryer, and so the kind of people who should be buying it go, well, we're trying not to eat any fried food, aren't we? Okay? It's exactly the wrong name. It's also placed in shops right next to the deep fat fryers, where the kind of people should be buying it won't be going at all. And someone came up to me afterwards, I can't take credit for this, and they said it's very easy. When you want to sell the Philips air fryer, just name it in French. Call it the air sauteuse. And people in John Lewis will be lining up round the fucking block. Because if you call any cookery process in French, do you remember that thing sous vide? As far as I can remember, you could achieve a sous vide effect by effectively putting your food in a Sainsbury's bag, stuffing it down your underpants, and walking around for a few hours on a hot day, right? But because it was French, it was basically botulism in a bag, right? But because it was French, everybody was giving it a go, okay? What you call something really, really matters. Now, I'm going to recap a little bit on what an earlier speaker said. The reason this is possible is because we don't see the world objectively in the first place. Why? Because it's not in our evolutionary interest to do so. If evolution can make a trade-off where it gets 2% extra fitness at the sacrifice of 20% of accuracy, it's going to make that trade-off. Because evolution doesn't give a shit about objectivity, it only cares about survival and reproductive fitness. So the idea, as Bob Trivers says, that evolution has given us nervous systems which produce ever more accurate images of the world is fundamentally deluded. If evolution can misrepresent the world to us in a way that helps us make a decision a millisecond faster and therefore avoid that nasty snake, that's what evolution is going to do. And there's a black box in our head over which we have no conscious awareness or control, which is basically distorting our view of reality all the time. One thing that's really important in evolutionary survival is avoiding ambiguity, because ambiguity causes you to dither. And so in this case, completely beyond our awareness, opaque to introspection, the brain goes, that's weird, I'm kind of seeing afar, but I'm hearing bar. More likely that I've misheard than I've misseen, so without asking permission, it just overwrites the B with an F. In evolutionary terms, contrast is much more important than, detecting contrast is much more important than detecting absolute values. Not much evolutionary value to carrying a Pantone chart around in our heads. Huge amount of evolutionary value in detecting something that doesn't quite blend with its background. A snake, for example. You see the green swirls and the blue swirls? They're exactly the same color. Similarly, if you've already seen the chessboard, but just to rub it in, if you put your fingers together, that looks like a grey thing hinged to a white thing. What the brain's doing is compensating for an assumed shadow effect. Put your fingers together so you cover the join between the top and the bottom, and you'll see that the top grey is objectively exactly the same as the bottom grey. And in everything we do, remember, value is just as much created by the man who creates the context as the person who creates the reality. Wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavier bottle. Painkillers are more effective if they're branded. Painkillers are more effective and wine is tastier if you tell people it's expensive. Okay? That works blind, that works if you, it's not even reported pain relief. If you attach electrodes to people's heads and tell people this is a really expensive painkiller, the pain goes away a lot more. I'm the only person in Britain who complains that you can't buy expensive aspirin anymore. Okay? This shit isn't going to work. It costs 39 fucking p, for God's sake. I haven't got a 39p headache. I've got a £2.79 headache, damn it. Okay? I want to spend some money on the aspirin that's commensurate with the bloody pain relief. All right? Now, the trick here, and this is a bastard sentence, I'm half proud of it, half ashamed of it, I should be able to do better. Look for things which are objectively similar, but subjectively different, or look for things which are objectively different, but subjectively similar. Uber, mostly a psychological hack. If you're a standard metrics taxi firm, you'd look at what the average wait time was in objective minutes and seconds. Okay? Really, really difficult to reduce that. You've got to have a lot of cab drivers driving around doing bugger all in order to reduce wait time. Doesn't do that. It uses a map to reduce the psychological pain of waiting. So the most successful thing the London Underground has done in terms of improving passenger satisfaction per pound spent isn't faster, more frequent, more comfortable trains. It's dot matrix displays on the platform. We'd rather wait 9 minutes for a train knowing it's 9 minutes than wait 6 minutes for a train in a state of uncertainty. Here, previously, you ordered a cab, they lied to you 10 minutes. After about 11 minutes, you're walking around in the rain going, maybe he's parked around the corner, shit, where has he gone, what's going on, maybe he's already left, okay? Low dignity, low certainty behaviour. We really don't like it. Here, you look at the map, and even if the bugger's late, you just go, oh, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll have another pint. Okay? You could also argue it contributes to ego. I don't know if anybody else do this, where you time your arrival on the pavement to coincide exactly with the arrival of the car, which makes you feel like Kaiser Soze in the end scene of The Usual Suspects. Okay? It makes you feel like Louis XIV. They also, by the way, you don't pay with money and you don't get a paper receipt. Things you buy on a contactless credit card feel 15% cheaper than anything you buy on chip and pin. All right? Remember that thing with Ed Sheeran? They said, let's drop the price. Every economist always says, no, don't drop the price. Make it feel cheaper, for God's sake. Now, just to give you a few more ideas, this is my favorite one. By the way, if you want a really good 10x psychological moonshot, electronic cigarettes. They basically work even if there's no nicotine. That's a psychological discovery, which is what smokers are more addicted to is the behaviour, less the drug. People should have known that already. There are experiments, by the way, this only works with relatively heavy drinkers. If you give a heavy drinker gin and tonic, and then for the rest of the evening, give him tonic water in a glass where the rim has been dipped in gin, not only does the guy not notice, he becomes pissed. Okay? So his brain isn't waiting for the alcohol to kick in. It goes, I've had 8 gins and tonics, so I better behave like 8 gin and tonics, me, and start swaying around and becoming mildly objectionable. Okay? Now, with the electronic cigarette, what's interesting is, to the slight fear of the tobacco industry, by the way, it seems to me that the nicotine is less important than having a hot thing stimulate your trigeminal nerve somewhere at the back of the throat. That's a 10x. Here's a 10x, which is a work of genius from an EasyJet pilot. You know when you land at an airport and the plane engines wind down before you reach the terminal, and you all get that sinking feeling of, oh shit, it's going to be a bus, right? And you all hate the bus. And everybody goes, oh shit, it's going to be a bus. And I've been doing that for 15 years. And then this pilot says something. Now, you know the fox and the grapes. This is thousands, we should have known this. This insight comes from Aesop. It's 2,500 years old, for God's sake, okay? That we will try and minimize unhappiness. If you give us a bit of good news and a bit of bad news, we'll focus on the good news to minimize regret. So never give someone something that is unqualified bad news. Always put some sugar in it somewhere. So, we land, the engines wind down, I'm just about to think, oh shit, it's going to be a bus. And I feel cheated, I kind of paid for an air bridge. And the pilot says, I've got some good news and some bad news. Very, very interesting psychologically, by the way, that trade-offy line. It's automatically believable. The brain kind of expects a trade-off. Look at a lot of the best advertising lines of all time. Reassuringly expensive, good things come to those who wait. We're number 2, so we try harder. You either love it or you hate it. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, which Salman Rushdie wrote, by the way, when he worked at Ogilvy, before he decided to squander his talent by writing Midnight's Children instead. Okay? All of those things kind of work because there's a bit of a kind of yes but. IKEA deliberately makes shopping a pain in the arse so that you think you're saving money through the experience rather than through the quality of the furniture. If we don't get told a trade-off, we assume one. Low-cost airlines went on and on about what you didn't get. You don't get a meal, you don't get a pre-allocated seat, you don't get your luggage checked in. Why? Because it made the low cost seem comprehensible and believable. If EasyJet had come into the market and said, we're just as good as British Airways, but we're half the price, the human brain does not go, wow, that's brilliant. It goes, there's something wrong there. That probably means you don't bother servicing the engines and your pilots are all on day release from prison, right? Now, what the pilot said was, there's some good news and some bad news. Bad news and some good news. The bad news is there's a plane blocking our gate, so I won't be able to get you an air bridge. The good news is that the bus will take you all the way to near passport control, so you won't have far to walk with your bags. Well, I suddenly thought, that's always true. But nobody had ever told us before. Try this. Next time you're on a plane and there's a bus, say to the person next to you, ideally someone you know so you don't look weird, actually, I'm glad there's a bus because it drives you all the way to passport control so you don't have to walk through a fucking larger version of blue water to reach the passport thing. You've just synthesized happiness in everybody around you. It's always true. No one had ever told us, so we hadn't got the material with which to frame a positive around the bus. With behavioural science, I haven't got time to describe this. There are brilliant ideas where the reduction of the prescription of unnecessary antibiotics is achieved at no emotional cost to doctor or patient by encouraging doctors to offer post-dated prescriptions. When you give a prescription to antibiotics, even if you say, don't use these unless you're feeling really terrible, the bugger nips next door into Boots, pays £8 for the antibiotics. Because they paid £8, sunk cost bias means I better start using these. 4 days later, they've probably started getting better of their own accord. And once you start getting better of your own accord, your appetite for taking drugs diminishes dramatically. But secondly, 67% of the people given a delayed prescription don't actually cash it in, and a certain percentage of the people cash it in and don't even take them. Now, given that of the remaining 33%, maybe 15 or 20% should be taking the antibiotics because they're still ill, that is almost an order of magnitude reduction in the provision of unnecessary antibiotics, leading to that terrible problem of immune strains of bacteria effectively evolving. There are psychological moonshots all over the place precisely because we're much more wrong about psychology than we are about physics. The fact that we're ignorant about this stuff as a business person should make us optimistic. Why as a business person? Remember, you're not academics. If you're an academic, if you're a scientist, your job is to be right about something. If you're a business person, you've just got to be less wrong than the other bastard. There's a whole business to be made in just being less wrong than the other guy. So, great way of describing marketing is simply the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. Find out what economists would assume, and then basically go, what if that's bollocks? And there's a very large chance that it is, by the way, okay? Now, let me give you an example of this. Let's say, now this is where I get onto my final point about are we being paid and encouraged to be boring. I want you to imagine you're in a business meeting and someone says, for 150 years, Coca-Cola has been the most popular cold, non-alcoholic drink in the world, apart from water. We want some of that action. What do we do? And the economists in the room will probably say something like this. You just need to produce a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can so people get great value for money. Now, who's going to disagree with that, okay? It's all consistent with standard, very narrow economic theory about what motivates human behavior. Utility, cost, volume, okay? All measurable things. To disagree with that, you've got to be a real weirdo. You're sticking your neck above the parapet, okay? So there's a fundamental problem in all business settings, which is that no one ever gets fired for pretending that economics is true. If you went along and you produced a nicer tasting, colder drink, nicer tasting, cheaper drink that came in a really big can and it failed, everybody would attribute failure to the foibles of consumer behavior. No one would ever blame you. And yet, what's the most successful attempt to compete with Coca-Cola in 150 years? It's this. It comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting, right? And when I say it tastes disgusting, I drink it myself. They researched it with a company that only researches the taste of carbonated beverages. And they reported back and said, this is the worst report we've had from respondents in the entire history of our company. Normally people say things like, it's not my thing, it's a bit too sweet, it's more for kids. Their reports on Red Bull in blind tastings, things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. Now, I think there is a psychological way to understand it, which is that, think about those trade-offs again, right? Do you remember those little things I was talking about? I don't think the innate human unconscious believes something can have medicinal or psychotropic powers unless it tastes a bit weird. That's why health food has to taste shit, okay? If you make delicious health food, no one believes it. The first brief we ever had as Ogilvy change, someone rings up from Belgium and says, we've produced these 20% lower fat biscuits. No one can tell the difference in blind tastings, and yet we've put them on sale and the sales have fallen off a cliff. And we didn't even, it was like the guy, you know that thing Quantico, the FBI profilers? There's a guy there working there, and someone rang him up and described a crime scene, and he just replied, without putting the phone down, he just said, look for the local arsehole with a cut hand. Okay, right? Sure enough, that's the guy. In this case, it was exactly the same. Without putting the phone down, we said, you didn't put 20% lower fat on the packaging, did you? I said, well, of course we did. We spent millions of pounds reducing the fat. We wanted to tell people about it. If you put lower fat on the packaging, the biscuits will taste like shit. Okay? Remember, everything we perceive as a blurry mix of information formed into a coherent whole by unconscious processes. If you want, by the way, anybody think you're buying a new car? Don't bother, okay? Take your existing car and have it really well valeted. Not only will it be cleaner, it'll drive better, it'll be quieter, it'll be more comfortable. Everything about that car becomes better when you have it valeted. Because our perception is highly leaky. We think we can separate what we hear from what we taste, from what we know. Nah, okay? Now, first bit of advice, and this is difficult advice to follow. Test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. All the other bastards in business are testing the kind of things that make sense to an economist. So by doing the same thing, you won't learn very much. Do what an economist wouldn't do, and you may fail, but if you succeed, that's really something valuable. Simplest bit of advice I can give, if you've got a product that isn't selling, put the price up. Ed Sheeran, part of the problem was it was implausibly cheap, okay? Secondly, by the way, do you notice when they finally persuaded the couple to go in, they used, any Robert Cialdini fans here? Must be one. Persuasion, and Influence. Two of the great books everybody in this business should read, okay? Bob Cialdini, University of Arizona. Just to get back, they said, it's going to get pretty busy later on. Do you remember that? Better go now. You only get 30 seconds, that's trade-off. It's going to get pretty busy later on, and you only get 30 seconds. All of those things were basically promoting scarcity value. It was the Australian equivalent of those airline websites which say only 5 seats left at this price. I've spent 28 years studying this behavioural science stuff. That sentence still works on me. I know exactly what you're trying to do, and I still click anyway. Okay? Now, it's really, really difficult to test counterintuitive things. It's much, much easier to get fired for being illogical than for being unimaginative. There is a solution to this, and the first solution is to create a separate budget and a separate B space. When you're in the 80% pollen collection following the waggle dance space, the standard metrics of business should apply. When you're in the 20% space, you should have a far higher tolerance of failure. You should merely look at the overall probabilistic gains. If you have something where, by the way, you can fail fast and cut off early, and where the potential upside is huge, do it. So the problem is that in the standard B space, if you live only among the Bs who are optimizers, it's very, very difficult to go off in a random direction, because everybody thinks you're an idiot. If you create a space to do it, it becomes easier because you just say, that's why, by the way, most successful large companies fail to innovate. IBM produced the PC by sending their weirdest employee to Boca Raton in Florida, deliberately 2,000 miles from head office, in order for him to do something different. That's why entrepreneurs succeed, because actually they're essentially allowed, they don't have to report to the same group of boring bees. So, very quickly, this effect is amplified by what I think is probably a very important concept. You're a proper psychologist, by the way, I'm just an ad guy, okay? So tell me if I'm wrong in anything. Anybody heard of Herbert Simon? Got the Nobel Prize for Economics, pioneer of general polymath, pioneer of artificial intelligence, pioneer of decision-making under uncertainty. Now, most of you, when you think about making a decision, or when you think about a consumer making a decision, you're thinking it's an optimization problem. A straight, unambiguous optimization problem. Archery is a straight, unambiguous optimization problem. You aim for the middle. There's no way you'll get more than 10. The way to aim to get 10 is to aim for the middle. If you just miss, you'll get 9. If you miss a bit more, you'll get 8. If you miss a bit more than that, you'll get 7. If you miss a bit more than that, you'll get 6. There is no strategy in archery other than aim for the bastard in the middle, which may explain why archery has never made it big as a televised sport. I mean, imagine being an archery commentator. What do you think he's going to do, Barry? I think he's going to aim right for the middle of the target, just like he has the last 4,000 fucking times, right? It's not really a game of deep strategy, game theory, and variation. Real world decisions are not like archery most of the time. They're a bit like darts. Do not, by the way, if you want to steal these slides, you can. I'm really happy. I'm an evangelist. Don't use this slide in France. I did it 2 weeks ago. Not a great darting nation. They've got many virtues, but their conception of darts is very, very weak, okay? But the best thing to do if you're not very good at darts, or if the board's moving, or if you're not sure, or if you're drunk, aim for the southwestern quadrant of the board. You won't get triple 20, or you probably won't, unless you're really bad at darts, but you might get triple 19, you might get triple 16, and you won't get a 1 or a 5. That kind of decision making, roughly speaking, is called satisficing. You're making a decision where you're trying to reduce the minimum as much as you're trying to increase the possible maximum. Now, let's just look at this in evolutionary terms. It's really important. Nearly all decisions taken on the savannah were probabilistic. You didn't have perfect information. You didn't have perfect trust. So every decision you took involved a degree of uncertainty. If you take a decision where there's uncertainty involved, you have to consider two things. You have to consider the average and the variance. Okay? How good is this decision on average? If you only looked at the average, you'd probably die. Because something with a high average but a high variance includes a 1% chance of extinction or death. It's not worth climbing up a tree 200 feet to get 5% better cherries if it comes with a 2% chance of death. So you have to consider two things. How good is this on average, and what's the worst that can happen? And our brains have evolved to ask both those questions when we make a decision. I did think of an example of a decision which is, now, okay, this is the most successful restaurant in the world in a way because it's relatively low average, very low variance, okay? So, how many people have ever got the shits after, no one's going to answer that question, after eating at McDonald's? Answer, practically nobody. Fair? I'm willing to have someone disagree, okay? How many people have had the shits after eating at a Michelin-starred restaurant? Come on, somebody has. You're just not, yeah, exactly, okay? Now, what I'm saying is that Michelin-starred restaurants have a higher average, greater chance of disappointment, greater chance of botulism, greater chance of feeling ripped off. There are a whole load of potential negatives with an expensive restaurant that although it has a higher average than McDonald's, we actually quite like a bit of a low variance. And we'll pay a premium for it. That's my theory, by the way. The main reason consumers pay a premium for brands is not because they think branded goods are better, but because they think they're less likely to be shit. If you've got a really, really big investment in your reputation, you have much more to lose from selling a bad product than someone I've never heard of. So a brand is not a guarantee of high average, but it's a guarantee of low. McDonald's is the most popular restaurant in the world, not because it's very, very good, but because it's really, really good at not being shit. Okay? Now, once you understand that this colours decision making, even, for example, when you have penalty kickoffs to decide a World Cup final, the players would be more likely to score on average when taking penalties if they kick the ball straight down the middle. They're very reluctant to do this. Why? Not because you're less likely to score. You're more likely to score, but you look much stupider if you fail. So even when taking penalties to decide a World Cup quarter-final, they're involved in disaster minimization more than score maximization. We found this, for example, working with Diageo. No man will ever risk ordering a cocktail in a bar unless the menu includes a picture or an illustration of the glass in which it's served. Because if the male brain thinks there's a 0.001% chance it arrives with a fucking umbrella and a sparkler and a pineapple, he'll order a beer instead. That's what I mean about, I meant to show the video of the cat with a cucumber, but you can do it at home. If you put a cucumber just outside your cat's field of view when it's eating, when it turns round and catches first sight of the cucumber, all it sees is a low-down green thing with a pointy nose. There's only a 1% chance it's a snake. Why take the risk? Watch it on YouTube on your phone. I'm sorry, I missed that out. So, once you understand disaster minimization as well as average optimization, and it's an interesting question about programmatic. What part of programmatic works because it's making something better and better, and what part works? Evolution, remember, works in both directions. It works by killing off the worst, and it works by sort of elevating the best. Which of those two things should you focus on most? Interesting question. Herd behavior, social copying. Totally irrational, according to economists. Totally rational if you're trying to avoid disaster. Do what everybody else does. May not be the best decision you can make, but it won't be terrible. Habit is a really, really potent behavior. I've done it lots of times before. It's always been fine. I'll stick with that. And our habit, by the way, gets stronger as we get older, because we have more past experience to draw on, and we have less future to benefit from experimentation. So our kind of risk-safety ratio shifts a bit as we age. I'll end with a final thing. I mean, if anybody's dying, I won't be offended if anybody leaves, because it is really hot. I've got a theory here. This has a bearing exactly on what you said. A peacock's tail is an advertisement to peahens that I'm a really fit peacock because I can afford to produce this spectacular decorative tail. But it's actually a disadvantage to the peacock. It's an Israeli biologist called Amos Zahavi who coined this, the handicap theory of signaling. That meaningful signaling generally involves cost. Bumblebees have evolved to prefer flowers that smell of a chemical that you need to have in order to produce nectar. Why? Because someone who can produce that smell patently has a lot of nectar. Because it's costly to produce that smell. It uses a necessary chemical, not an incidental one. If you had a friend who had a horse, and they said, how do you think your horse is going to do on the race on Saturday? And they said, oh, it's definitely going to win. You basically ignore the information because it has no skin in the game. If they took you to the bookmaker and you saw them place a £5,000 bet on the horse, that's really significant information. The guy who knows that horse best not only says it's going to win, he genuinely believes it. And the cost of a communication, now cost doesn't just mean financial cost. It could be effort, it could be use of scarce resources, craftsmanship, talent, humour, good manners, effort, anything that's basically difficult, scarce, costly. I would argue humans instinctively react more. The most efficient way to invite someone to your wedding is by email. You can get all the information there, it's free, and it arrives instantaneously. I would argue if you got invited to 2 weddings on the same day, and the other one arrived on a card which was embossed with a stamp and a handwritten envelope, you'd go to that one. The email invitation slightly stinks of cash bar, doesn't it? Let's be honest here, okay? So we infer as humans, I believe, not only from what something says, but the cost of saying it. Because proof of sincerity comes from having skin in the game. We partly feel safe on an aeroplane because they make the pilot sit at the front. Okay? The peacock, the peahen, it's a bloody great burden carrying that tail around. It makes you visible to predators. It's a hugely heavy thing. But the peahen goes, if that guy can survive while still carrying that huge thing around for purely decorative purposes, when it serves no survival function, he must be a pretty fit bird, and I wouldn't mind some of his DNA. Okay? Think about it, you know, if women were attracted to men who owned expensive vehicles, they'd all chase lorry drivers and coach drivers. Those don't work for signalling purposes because they're actually economically useful. Having a two-seater sports car in London, on the other hand, that really shows you've got resources because you can waste them. So conspicuous inefficiency is a form of communication. I would also argue, and this is where programmatic gets really problematic, that conspicuous long-termness really matters to human instinct. Now, here's a bit of game theory, right? When the future value of a relationship outweighs the one-off gain of cheating someone, that's when it pays to be honest. Therefore, instinctively, by proxy, humans should have evolved an instinct that people who have a long time horizon are going to be better people to do business with than people with a short time horizon. If you're invested in an immobile asset, like a kebab shop, you're more trustworthy than the kebab van. The kebab van can poison everybody in the town and merely drive 30 miles away. The kebab shop has a lease, it has equipment, it has lots and lots of reasons to play a longer term game. Before TripAdvisor, most tourist restaurants were totally shit because they knew they were only going to see you once. There was no incentive to be any better than legally required simply because you weren't coming back anyway, okay? So I think we instinctively look at behavior that is costly, where the cost only makes sense within the framework of a long-term, continuously repeating relationship. I think we automatically see that as attractive and trustworthy. Now, let me give you an example of this. An engagement ring, upfront expense, proof of long-term intention. Okay? Do you notice however rich the guy is, it's got to cost an amount of money that really hurts? Okay? There's no ceiling on engagement rings. Okay? It's got to cost you an amount of money that hurts, and it is evidence of your sincerity and intent and belief in the long-term possibilities of the relationship. No one's going to buy one of those to get a one-night stand because there are cheaper alternatives. This is a reliable sign of commitment. One of the reasons, by the way, women like being bought jewellery and flowers is precisely because men aren't interested in jewellery and flowers. So there's, if you think about it, it's an entirely sacrificial, demonstrative act. It's an act of pure generosity without any other consideration of motive. Why? Think about it, okay? For the females in the room, if your boyfriend buys you jewellery or flowers for Christmas, he's thinking of you. If he buys you a drone for Christmas, there's the possible suspicion of self-interest. Fair? You know, darling, it's the quad bike you always wanted, isn't really what you want to hear on Christmas Day. Okay? So I think we instinctively know this. When Five Guys gives us the extra fries, you all know that? That you order small, medium or large, they fill the cup up to the top as they're legally required to do, then they take a massive extra scoop and they wang it in your bag. That is evidence, because it comes post-purchase, just like the, you know, the mint you get with your bill, it's evidence of, well, I wanted a name for it, so I got in touch with evolutionary biologists, and they call it continuation probability. So we'll use that to avoid creating creating ambiguity. Amazon doesn't understand it, Selfridges does. Has anybody bought anything from Selfridges? You get, now you've already paid, right? Now, Selfridges online I think is great actually. I think we both benefit because, to be absolutely honest, it means I don't have to travel to London and they don't have a fat middle-aged Welshman wandering around their store ruining their user imagery. So I think we both win from this, okay? Right? But all this shit happens after you've paid. The parcel arrives in a fantastic box. The box is lined with gorgeous shininess. The Selfridges logo is on the box. There is striped yellow and white paper and a fantastic varying sticker that says something like, you know, you've just found something else amazing at Selfridges. You get an email the second it arrives to say, I hope you like it. All of that is discretionary effort, which is continuity, probability, signaling. Okay? We wouldn't be doing this shit if we were just out to sell you one thing. So we're clearly on the right hand of game theory. the right hand of that thing, where we're looking to make money from long, repeated interactions. I might argue an expensive launch advertising campaign is exactly the same as an engagement ring. If you didn't believe your product was going to be widely and repeatedly popular, you wouldn't spend the money committing it to it. And your point about there was a whole degree of commitment in advertising back in our day. You're only 40, I'm 51. But back in the day, there was a whole level of commitment, effort. Creativity, by the way, is just another form of costly signaling. Poetry is more meaningful than prose because it's more difficult to write. It's more difficult to say something creatively than it is boringly. And therefore, we see that as a mark of sunk cost effort in the communication. If you're getting married and you haven't got a lot of money, okay, and you can't afford to do the whole embossed wedding invitation, that's fine. You can do it in an email, but it's got to be really creative. Remember that, okay? If you just put the parents of invite you to and send the email, bullshit, right? You can do it by email, but it's got to be really creative. If you have no imagination whatsoever, do the expensive thing and send it by FedEx, right? Creativity and media cost, in some sense, are multiplicative in terms of communicating the sincerity of communication. Selfridges stuff, by the way, I think they've made it more expensive. 15 quid, you used to get unlimited free delivery for a year. So here's a little question. How much of marketing is the costly signaling of long time horizons? Continuation probability. The way we currently measure digital advertising, think about it. It's all about what's easy to measure. What's easy to measure is what you do before and in the immediate run-up to the purchase. Nobody's investing anything after the purchase because it's harder to justify and it's harder to measure. So and combine this with the shareholder value movement, which prioritizes short-term profit maximization over anything else, and we are creating businesses that look like psychopaths to the people who do business with them. Because the obsession with measurement means that the only communications you produce are essentially self-interested. If consumers didn't notice the difference between self-interested and not self-interested, that wouldn't matter. My contention is they really, really do. A classic example, luxury goods, okay? Anybody, again, mainly a female example, if you've spent, where is the threshold of fashion spending? 150 quid, 200, where the bastards have to give you a rope-handled bag. What is the point? Does anybody know? With cosmetics, you know, over a certain amount, they're going to chuck in a load of free samples. The significance of the rope-handled bags are worse than polythene bags in practical terms. The reason they mean so much is because they cost more. And it's continuity probability signaling that after you've made the purchase, they don't stop being nice. So there you go. I'll end on one final slide. Why is it so bloody hard in business? Now, you remember that thing I told you about satisficing? That we're always asking the question instinctively, not just how good is this on average, but what's the worst that could happen? Now, among individual consumers, that's a pretty good way to operate. Okay, I think satisficing is a rational way to operate. At a very, very simple level, tell me if I'm wrong here, by the way, because you're a proper psychologist, okay? But you can, a very, very simple model of understanding human decision-making is regret minimization. Do whatever, and that explains prospect theory and a few other things. Do whatever will minimize the chance of regret. When you put people in a business, that changes, because it's no longer regret minimization, because their interests aren't aligned with the interests of the employer. It turns into blame minimalization, not regret minimalization. So as a result, everybody wants to do the bog standard economic standard approach, which the computer model suggests, because if you follow an algorithm, you don't get blamed because you haven't put your neck on the line. Any exercise of subjective judgment is career threatening because now you're the person who gets blamed, not the algorithm, not the committee, not the economic model. So being subjective in business is really, really scary because the upside isn't that great. And we call this the Heathrow effect, and I'll explain this. You can fly all business class, 48 seats, London City, direct to New York. There used to be 2 flights a day, there's now only 1. British Airways have trouble filling it. It's a fantastic thing. It takes you about 15 minutes to board, you clear customs in Ireland so you don't have to wait at the other end. It's a brilliant service, and yet it's nearly empty. Why is that? If you ask the travellers, The travellers love it. But it's all business class, so it's not booked by the traveller, it's booked through an intermediary, typically a PA, typically a travel agent. What does both the PA and the travel agent do? Once you understand they're trying to avoid a 1 and a 5, they're not trying to hit a triple 20. What they do is very simple. They always book you a flight from Heathrow to JFK. Okay? Now, Ogilvy in New York is much closer to Newark. I live much closer to Gatwick and London City. Doesn't matter, it's always Heathrow JFK. Why? That's the no one ever got fired for buying IBM answer. Okay? If I book my boss on Heathrow to JFK and something goes wrong, he blames British Airways. You can't ring me up and go, what the fuck were you thinking? But, you know, booking me on a flight from the world's second busiest international airport. Are you mad, right? You can't get angry at someone who goes Heathrow JFK because it's the default. The second you deviate from the default, if anything goes wrong, you blame me. I would have been in New York by now if you hadn't booked me out of this fucking Toy Town airport. So in business, people will do almost anything to avoid blame. A huge amount of research is merely arse covering dressed up as rigor. It doesn't affect what people subsequently do. It's simply there for support rather than illumination. And once you understand that safety bias, there are ways you can manage around it, but instinctively, one of the reasons economics is so powerful, one of the best things you can do, okay, if something isn't selling, put the price up. If you put the price down and you still don't sell, you did what you're supposed to do, so no one shouts at you. If you put the price up, you might discover you sell more and at a higher price. It often happens, but if it doesn't work, people will shout at you. That's why, by the way, there are only 4 big accounting firms. Appoint Price Waterhouse, if anything goes wrong, everybody blames Price Waterhouse. Appoint a small boutique firm, it might be better, faster and cheaper, but if anything goes wrong, now they'll blame you. So once you understand that satisficing, when applied to business decisions, basically rewards a form of cowardice, then you understand how, first of all, why entrepreneurial businesses are different, but you also understand why big businesses need to change the way they look at risk and reward if they aren't going to get bored into total tedious conformity. I hope that was useful. I'm sorry to keep you so long, and thank you very much indeed.